Welcome back to Tightwad Workshop. We've got another commission project today in this little blue stool. It's nothing fancy, but it's really special to the lady who owns it because it was made for her by her father 50 years ago. Now most of its joints have already lost their glue and started to come apart. So I think the best thing for us to do is to take the frame fully apart. That way we can clean all the old glue off the joints and clean all of the old paint off at the same time. Let's get started with that now. We'll start by removing the seat cover. I'll use a screwdriver to pry these tacks loose. We want to preserve the history here, so I'll save the tacks and reuse them in the new seat upholstery. These small tacks pull right through the vinyl, so we'll need to remove them later. Once all the tacks are removed, the seat cover and padding can be lifted off. It looks like the stool was originally painted green, then overpainted with blue later. This fibrous padding might be reusable, but the sponge padding's totally worn out. This is a vent hole. It allows the air held in the padding to escape when somebody sits on the stool. These 8 brass screws hold the seat in place, so I'll just go ahead and remove them. Now we can start disassembling the frame. The upper rail on each side is held together with glue and screws. The screws have been painted over, so we'll need to uncover them first. It looks like Bert used brass screws here as well. Now we can wiggle the rail and break it loose. This glue was brown and brittle, so it was probably old school woodworking glue made from animal hide. I don't have any hide glue, so I'll do the reassembly using PVA glue instead. I'll remove the other side rail in the same way. Now the frame parts should be easy to separate. Okay, maybe not quite so easy. That's okay, the chip broke off cleanly, so we'll be able to glue it back again. You can still see the chisel marks here from where Bert cut these mortises 50 years ago. There's also another screw here holding this joint together. Before I go any further, I'll mark the 2 halves of each joint. Because this is a handmade stool, the various parts probably aren't interchangeable, and these markings will help us reassemble the stool correctly later. Now let's move on to the seat. We'll start by removing those small tacks from before. Then we can use a scraper to remove most of the paint from the parts. I don't like to use sandpaper to remove old paint like this because it sends a lot of dust into the air. And 50-year-old paint like this might also contain lead, which you really don't want to breathe in. Using a scraper like this is a lot faster than sanding, and it also doesn't make much dust. I've made a video showing how to make a scraper. You can find a link to it here. That one little stool definitely did hold a lot of paint. The scraper does a good job, so we'll only need to do a very small amount of finish sanding on the parts. So now we're ready to glue the frame back together. We'll do the 2 frame halves first, so we're not going to need these 2 pieces yet. I'll start by replacing that broken piece from before. It's best to remove any excess glue with a wet rag before it dries out. Now we can put some glue on the rail, spread it over all the surfaces and fit it into place. We'll probably have to use a clamp to hold this end of the broken piece in place while the glue dries. Now we can glue and fit the other end of the rail in the same way. And finally we can glue and refit the upper rail. I've cleaned and polished the heads of these brass screws so they'll look nice. Now I can fit the 2 frame halves into my pair of sash clamps. I'm using these softwood blocks so the clamps won't dent the frame. So as expected, the end of the broken piece has lifted. I'll just use a hand screw clamp to hold it in place. This plastic bag will prevent the clamp from sticking to the frame. Once the glue's dried, we can remove the clamps. The 2 halves look good, so let's join them together. We'll start by gluing and fitting the 2 lower rails. Then we can glue the other ends and fit the second frame half on top. We'll need to attach the top of the stool to its frame next, so that we can put the legs into our clamps. I'll use some packing pieces underneath the stool's feet. Now I can set up the clamps to squeeze the feet together. Because the stool top holds the legs apart, squeezing the bottom of the legs will press the rails into position like this. Bert strengthened some of his frame joints with brass screws. We'll do the same, but we're going to use wooden dowels instead. I'll apply glue to the dowel as usual, then I'll tap it into place with a small hammer. The sound changes when the dowel hits the bottom of the hole. Now we can saw off the ends of the dowels and trim them with a chisel. Then we can give each dowel end a light sanding to finish it. So I think that's turned out pretty nicely, but we have had a change of plans in that Liz, the client, has decided that rather than reupholstering the top, she'd like me to make it into a little coffee table. Now in a way I'm kind of relieved about that because I know nothing about upholstery. Now I've already cut this nice piece of chipboard to make the top of the coffee table, but let's just jazz it up a little bit before we put it on. So after the glue dries, we can use a razor blade to trim the edges of the tabletop. I usually cut the matchsticks off first and then slice the stubs off flush with the chipboard. So that's looking pretty good, but it'll need some sort of perimeter frame to protect the edges. Luckily I've got a few pieces of suitable scrap timber to do the job. Now normally I'd show you a nice hand tool montage here, but this job's already a month late, so I'm just going to cheat and use the table saw instead. And to save time, I'll also cut the corner bevels on the table saw. So now we can take our tabletop frame parts back to the bench and glue them up. I'm trying to keep the top of the frame flush with the upper surface of the tabletop. I'll use softwood packing pieces to prevent the clamps from damaging the frame parts, the same as we did before. Once everything looks good, we can tighten the clamps. I'll just do one last quick check before I leave that glue to dry. And as usual, clean up any excess glue with a wet cloth before it dries. I can only glue and clamp 2 frame sides at a time because I only have 2 sash clamps. I'll glue and fit the remaining 2 pieces once this batch of glue is dried. I'm starting to think that the glue's going to need some reinforcement here, so let's add a couple of dowels on each side. I'll start by marking the dowel hole locations. These bench dogs will stop the table from pushing off the bench while I'm drilling and hammering. Now we can drill, hammer, saw, slice and sand the dowels the same as we did before. Once we've added the dowels to all 4 sides, we can attach the tabletop to the base. I'll just double check that it's correctly centered and aligned. And we'll also make sure that the screws aren't too long. We don't want them sticking out through the tabletop. I've adjusted the drill bit to have the same length as the screw so that it won't drill through the tabletop either. Now I'll use this countersinking bit to make a hole for the screw head. Then we can install the screw. Once we've installed all 4 of the screws, we can turn the table back upright. I'll use some of this wood stain to give the frame a nice dark colour all over. Once the stain's dried, we can apply the wood finish. I'm using a clear polyurethane for this table, which dries to a satin finish. So here's the finished product. The idea behind this restoration was to keep its history visible and to show as much of Bert's pencil lines and workmanship as possible. Obviously this style isn't going to be to everyone's taste, but Liz, the client, is happy with the result, and that's really what you have to focus on when you're working on a commission job like this. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Tightwad Workshop is filmed in front of a live studio audience.